Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the many news items we have for you are the new records being set in Michigan for the number of COVID-19 related hospitalizations, a rather disconcerting infographic which points out just how bad an idea it is to be an anti-vaxxer or not get vaccinated for the COVID-19 virus. Australia is reaching its own records regarding bushfires and just how bad they are, or at least that's the opinion of experts. And the final record that appears this week is one related to NASA and the chilies they've been growing in space. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with America's attempts to set records. Some records are desirable, for example, fastest runner, highest jumper, most goals scored in a game, and so on. Hospitalizations as a result of COVID-19 are not desirable records to try and achieve. Michigan is overachieving. According to hospital administrators and doctors across the state, they're currently hitting the capacity that they have in many intensive care units, and as a result, they need to expand that capacity. This is because many of the patients who are coming in with COVID-19 are either in need of advanced care or long-term care. Without enough staff, beds, or other resources to use, they're unable to meet that need. One hospital has had to decline more patient requests than patient requests it could accept, and that's a first time for them in any of their known history. What's worse is that this problem isn't reaching a head. Instead, this is just going to continue to climb based on the current information available, which shows an increase period over the recent weeks. It's taking days for some people to find a hospital that they can go to. One man had to take 2 days just to try and find a hospital in a metropolitan city. The numbers we're talking about aren't insignificant either. It's not like this is a repeat of 2020. Instead, the numbers we're currently seeing are higher than what was in 2020. When the hospitalizations first began and hit their last high point, it was approximately 420 as an average. The current average is 440, and as we've said, climbing. What should come as no surprise to anybody who's now familiar with this situation? 76% of those who are currently in hospital are unvaccinated. That 76% makes up 87% of those in the ICU and 88% of those who require ventilators. That means a fraction of individuals, 13 and 12% respectively, have been vaccinated, which means the unvaccinated make up by far and away the vast majority of those who are currently in hospitals, and for all the wrong reasons. That's where this infographic comes in rather handy. Not only is it a very succinct and effective summary, it's also a rather disconcerting summary of just how ineffective things can be if people aren't willing to get vaccinated. The data comes from Malaysia, and while yes, it is approximately 2 months old, the general trend should be the same. The number of people who died, if we look at this as a simple number of those who have the AstraZeneca, the Pfizer, the Sinovac vaccines, does grow gradually with each of these, Pfizer and AstraZeneca being by far and away the most effective. The Sinovac vaccine has, since its inception, been somewhat questionable. For most people who are going to be watching this video, if not all of them, they should be able to get either AstraZeneca or Pfizer, and you can see that with those two in mind, without being vaccinated, your risk skyrockets. The difference is every last one of those little pink boxes versus the green and yellow. And people think vaccines don't work. People can be stupid some days. Having now heard not only why you need to be vaccinated, but the impact and difference between being vaccinated and not vaccinated, you should now consider just how important that is coming across to the Omicron variant, which now has its own variant. The second version, or BA.2, has so far been identified 7 times. This is across South Africa, Australia, and Canada. It's likely to show up before long in a number of other countries. This is a variant that is distinct in its genetics from the original Omicron variant of the COVID-19 virus. The problem with this newest variant is that it's lost a particular gene which made it much easier to identify and pick out using PCR testing. That means we're going to have different behavior between them, and it may be somewhat difficult to figure out what exactly we're trying to tackle. Remembering that the Omicron variant is expected to outtake the Delta variant before long, and the Delta variant has spread very quickly but remained relatively stable since it started spreading. That the Omicron variant is as unstable as it is may either be very good or very bad depending on what happens. If, like certain other viruses, it's extremely unstable but spreads very quickly, it may burn out, and so it won't be able to take over. The problem will be if there is a stable variant within the various different mutations that does eventually take over, and then eventually starts changing. Until we have more information on the Omicron variant though, it's hard to say exactly what is happening. The only important difference between this variant and the original Omicron variant is just that PCR testing part. PCR testing is generally the standard method by which you can figure out if someone has COVID-19. That this makes it much more difficult to be able to figure that out doesn't prevent it. After all, we have things like rapid antigen testing. Going from the rather unpleasant news around COVID-19 to instead something that is far more positive. Old people who get the blue pill aren't going to have anywhere near the risk of Alzheimer's, or at least so says one study. The study claims that if you are getting Viagra, you have a 70% lower risk of Alzheimer's disease, which could either be spurious correlations, which are always entertaining, or it could actually be onto something. The exact mechanism by which that occurs isn't very clear. The study comes out of the Cleveland Clinic in America, and was able to look at a vast amount of data from 7.2 million people. And when they looked at who was taking the medication, they found that yes, there was in the period 6 years that they looked at, a much lower incidence of Alzheimer's in the cohort that had Viagra. As we've already said, just because there's a correlation doesn't mean it's the case, and that's more so for the example here where it is a retrospective study where you are just looking at data and there's no real information beyond that. It could well be that the 7.2 million people they found had some particular variables that they could not identify in this study that reduced their proclivity towards Alzheimer's disease. For example, being far more physically active. Although how exactly that would work with old people we're not quite sure. Other options include things like different treatments they could be receiving, the fact that they have better cardiovascular health. There are all manner of ways in which this could possibly not be a relationship that's worth exploring. At the same time, there are other indicators within the study that mean that it's worth looking at, if only because it may be a much easier method to treat people now with an approved medication than it is to wait on the development of vaccines that we've previously mentioned. Now that you are suitably feeling somewhat optimistic, it's time to dash that hope. There is currently a 120,000 square kilometre fire raging through the savanna regions of Australia. This has been going since October, and the professional firefighters and the other people who are assessing and researching this area are somewhat astounded by the scale of the fires that are happening now. These are the same sorts of fires that at one point caused ice glaciers start turning black and red from the smoke and soot that they generated. That's a lot of fire in a large area. Admittedly, this seems to be an annual event for Australia, and the Australians are largely used to it. If you're living in a country where everything tries to kill you, the environment adding fire to that equation really isn't that much more of an extra hassle. It's just going to be unpleasant if it gets close to any metropolitan centres or people who are living there. The upside to this particular fire is that it appears to be raging across the northern part of Australia, a largely uninhabited region. The problem with fire in Australia is that the wetter the rest of the year is, the more likely they are to have explosive growth in what will ultimately turn into fuel for the fires. As Australia enters late spring or summer, that explosive growth turns into fuel because it dries up from a lack of rain. This then leads to eventually something catching fire, whether from lightning, idiots throwing cigarette butts out, or something else entirely. This then means that these large areas of growth, which have been populated by high amounts of water throughout the rest of the year, now become huge areas of what is effectively raging bushfire, and they can last for incredibly long periods of time, weeks and possibly months. This means that large parts of Australia will burn for extremely long times. While it is true that parts of Australia have evolutionarily developed means to take advantage of this, for example, certain plant species must be exposed to extreme heat in order for their seeds to germinate. Other things, like wildlife, don't cope so well with fire. Going now from the extreme heat of wild raging bushfires to the incredible cold of a record-breaking freezing environment that kept water in liquid form. Yes, there is a certain oxymoron of saying freezing conditions and liquid water. The challenge here was to try and keep a droplet of water, just 150 nanometers wide across, as cold as could be possibly achieved, in this case negative 44 degrees Celsius, but still remain a liquid. At that point in time and temperature, it should have been frozen solid. Anything under 0 degrees Celsius or negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit will freeze. We have previously explored and explained some of the weirdness of water. For example, water is most dense at around 4 degrees Celsius. Anything above or below that, and you get differences. It's why ice floats on water, for instance. It's less dense than the liquid. This weirdness to water is why some of the most strange behaviors can be observed, including how researchers can manage to put it in a freezing environment but have it remain a liquid. The researchers were able to reduce the amount of freezing, if freezing occurred at all, by putting the tiny droplet of water on a soft surface, in this case a gel. By doing so, they could reduce the amount of nucleation that occurred, and by preventing nucleation, you don't get a freezing of the droplet. As is noted in the article, this sort of investigation is very important if you're going to start looking at things like cryopreservation. The ability to be able to freeze a living organism is almost impossible because the water itself freezes. The freezing water forms ice crystals, and the ice crystals destroy the cells that they are in. This thereby kills the thing you're trying to freeze in just about every case. If you can find a way to reduce the formation of ice crystals, while slowing down the metabolism and various other processes of the living organism, you can preserve them for a very long time. The final news item we have for you this week regards NASA and the ISS growing chilies in space. The challenge here was to try and figure out not just what would happen if you grow them in space, but whether or not they can be grown in the first place. Once it's established that you can, then you can start looking at whether or not there are other things that can be used for the same purpose. That purpose being the first reason that this has broken a record: feeding people in space. That's where the first record comes in. It's fed the most astronauts from a crop grown in space. The second record it broke was somewhat less remarkable, simply being the longest running experiment, that being 137 days versus the anticipated 120 days. This is still more than the 90 days of the previous experiment run in space. The ability to grow these was not just a simple case of taking seeds into space and planting them in an appropriate media. Instead, the difficulty here was not only dwarfing them to fit in space, but enabling them to be able to grow in particular media that's being used on the ISS. You then need to wonder what's going to happen in the peculiar microgravity of the ISS, and it appears that it does make these particular chilies far more spicy, or at least, that's how the astronauts involved have described them. NASA has said that they next plan to try and grow tomatoes on the space station. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.